Forget the slogans for a second. After weeks of bombing, the United States had to spend 339 munitions just to pull an F-15E Strike Eagle crew back out of Iran, with 123 used for the pilot and 216 more for the weapons systems officer. That is not what a clean, controlled endgame looks like. That is what it looks like when a war is already larger, messier, and more dangerous in the victory language built around it. Now stack that against the official scale of the campaign. 10,000 combat flights and more than 13,000 targets struck since Operation Epic Fury began. If numbers that extreme were producing real strategic closure, Washington would be showing you the exit. Instead, it is still selling you the cow. And here is the fracture line. After all of that firepower, U.S. intelligence could still only confirm about 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal destroyed. That is the moment the title stops sounding provocative and starts sounding clinical, because 13,000 strikes are a terrifying number, but still no exit is the real story. This channel lives in that gap between what power says and what the evidence says. If you want that layer without the sugarcoating, subscribe now, and tell me in the comments whether 13,000 strikes sounds like control to you, or confession that control is exactly what Washington does not have. This is how hard the contradiction has become. The site under bombardment was still refusing to end the war without guarantees that it would not be attacked again. That means the bombs were landing. The targets were piling up. And yet Tehran was still speaking in conditions, not in surrender. That one line destroys the safe version of the story. The safe version says, overwhelming forces already decided the outcome, and the rest is paperwork. The real version says, overwhelming force has not yet produced a settlement strong enough to shut the war down on Washington's terms. And that is exactly why the strike count keeps being pushed so hard. Because when the political outcome is still slipping, governments start trying to turn volume into proof. They start hoping that destruction itself will feel like victory, even before victory exists. This was not just one dramatic line thrown out by a politician. U.S. Central Command itself said it had struck over 13,000 targets in the war so far. Once the military command is foregrounding the number like that, you are looking at more than an update. You are looking at a narrative strategy. And the narrative strategy is obvious. If you cannot yet show the audience a stable exit, show them scale. If you cannot yet show the war ending, show them the damage. If you cannot yet show political transformation, show them wreckage and dare them to mistake that for closure. But the audience clicking this title is not stupid. They are not clicking because they want another sterile count of bombs dropped and facilities hit. They are clicking because 13,000 strikes should have meant something final. And the fact that it did not means something has already gone very wrong beneath the official script. That is where Imperial Overstretch enters the story. Not as a moral slogan, not as a left-wing or right-wing talking point. As a mechanism. As the moment when a power with enormous military reach begins to discover that each display of force creates fresh obligations, fresh costs, and fresh reasons, the operation cannot simply stop. Look at the force posture and the mechanism becomes visible. Before the newest reinforcements were even being prepared, there were already 50,000 U.S. troops in the region. A campaign that is supposedly converging on success is not supposed to look like it might need a thicker military cushion just to sustain itself. That matters because empires do not usually realize they are overstretched when the first missiles fly. They realize it later, when limited action starts behaving like a living organism. It wants more protection, more logistics, more deterrence, more rescue capacity, more contingency forces, more political exceptions, more room to keep going, and every one of those additions comes wrapped in the same promise. This is still controlled. This is still temporary. This is still focused. This is still nothing like the disasters that came before. But in war, the adjective never matters as much as the pattern, and the pattern here is widening burden, not narrowing exposure. Go back to the rescue mission and think about what it really means. One downed crew, one trapped officer, one rescue package swollen into a major operation inside hostile space. That is not just battlefield drama. It is the human-scale version of the largest strategic truth. A war advertised as domination is already producing retrieval costs that feel like escalation. That is why the opening image matters so much. Not because it is emotional, because it is diagnostic. When a superpower can hit thousands of targets and still gets dragged into a huge, high-risk recovery operation for one crewman, you are watching the difference between destroying things and controlling the consequences of destroying them. Then the war widens again. Daily traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped about 95% after the war began. That means the conflict is no longer just about what was hit in Iran. It is now about whether the strongest military in the world can restore normality to one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. That is a much more humiliating test than people realize. Bombing military targets is what great powers are supposed to do well. Restoring confidence, reopening commerce, stabilizing a choke point, protecting allied infrastructure, and making insurance markets believe the danger has passed. That is a different kind of power, and it is the kind that is now wobbling. Because Tehran never needed to beat Washington in the air, it only needed to keep enough threat alive that every claim of imminent success sounded premature. It only needed to preserve enough leverage over shipping, energy, and regional anxiety that mission accomplished kept turning into one more week of risk management. That is why pure metrics and technological supremacy do not tell the whole story about a war's trajectory. A military can dominate the sky and still fail to dominate the logic of how the war ends. Bigger numbers do not automatically become bigger control. Once the conflict moves from target destruction into political endurance and systemic disruption, this is the part mainstream coverage keeps flattening. It treats the war like a scoreboard. Targets hit, senior figures killed, facilities damaged, salvos intercepted. But that is only the visible surface. The deeper game is about conversion. Can the United States convert spectacular military performance into a stable political outcome before the costs of continuation start to eat the value of what it is trying to achieve? Right now, that answer looks ugly, because the strike count keeps climbing, but the same three problems keep surviving it. Iran still has enough capability left to matter. Hormuz still matters enough to terrify everyone. And Washington still has not produced an off-ramp that does not sound either coercively unfinished or strategically embarrassing. That is why still no exit is the blade in this title. The strike number gets the click. The absence of exit is what should keep the viewer there. Because once a war this violent still cannot close, the question stops being, how hard can America hit? And becomes, what exactly can America no longer force? Iran reportedly retained the vast majority of its small naval vessels and mine-laying craft, which means the economic war can intensify even as the military war appears to slow. That single fact is poison for the clean victory narrative. It means Tehran does not have to win in the air if it can keep making order too expensive to restore at sea. And that is the real asymmetry of this war. The stronger side is investing in destruction. The weaker side is investing in denial of closure. The stronger side wants the battlefield to prove its superiority. The weaker side wants the region, the shipping lane, and the global market to prove that superiority is not enough. That is why the conflict starts feeling bigger every few days, even when the official rhetoric insists it is almost done. A tanker route breaks, an ally gets nervous, a rescue operation explodes in size. Troops surge, costs expand, messaging gets louder. The war keeps pretending to be in its final act while adding props for another scene. And that is almost the textbook, beginning of overstretch. Not collapse, not defeat, but the creeping inability to keep means and ends aligned. The military means remain immense. The political ends become slippery. The result is not weakness, it is excess without resolution. That is also why the regime change talk matters so much. There is little evidence to support the claim that Iran has already been transformed at the level that actually counts. The personnel can change, the funerals can multiply, the pressure can intensify, but if the underlying structure still functions, then the war has not delivered the political revolution implied by its own rhetoric. And once that becomes clear, the whole public story gets more dangerous. Because if the regime has not really been transformed, then either Washington has to accept the bloodier version of the same adversary still standing, or it has to push for even more force in search of a result that has already proved harder than the opening strikes were supposed to make it. That is how great powers get trapped by their own opening success. The early damage is real, so the leadership starts believing the decisive outcome must be just one more cycle away. Then every cycle that fails to produce it becomes justification for the next. Momentum turns into dependency. Activity turns into structure. Escalation turns into habit. This is also where the information war becomes critical. Washington benefits from saying Iran is running out of options because that keeps domestic patience alive. Tehran benefits from signaling endurance because that turns survival into psychological leverage. The truth sitting between those narratives is the dangerous part. Enough destruction to claim success, enough survival to deny closure. That middle zone is where empires bleed. Not when they are clearly winning, not when they are clearly losing, but when they are strong enough to keep going and weak enough, strategically, that stopping becomes politically costly. And now the war starts talking through the budget. The expenditures were already large enough to raise the prospect of going back to Congress for additional funds. That is the point where a campaign stops being just a burst of force abroad and starts becoming a domestic strategic appetite that must be fed. Money matters here, not because budgets are boring, but because budgets expose truth. States can lie with rhetoric far more easily than they can lie with what wars begin demanding from them. Once a conflict starts asking for more funds, more stockpile replacement, more sustainment, and more future trade-offs, it is announcing that the original framing was too small, and there is a second wound hidden inside that. Every additional dollar, every diverted system, every extra layer of force protection is a decision not made somewhere else. That is what imperial overstretch means in material terms. A state does not need to be bankrupt to be overstretched. It only needs to find that every new war begins competing with every other priority it said was existential. So when officials try to reassure the public by saying, America can handle this, that is not really the question. Of course it can handle a lot. The real question is what handling it requires. If the answer is more money, more troops, more sea control, more legal stretching, and more indefinite pressure without a clear end state, then can handle is no longer the same as is strategically wise. There is one more layer, and it is the institutional one. The tactics used to stretch war-making authority now form part of a playbook future administrations can draw from. That means the system is not just fighting this war. It is learning from it in a way that may make future deepening easier, faster, and more normalized. That should terrify any viewer who thinks the danger ends when this specific campaign ends. Because once the machinery of escalation becomes easier to activate than the machinery of restraint, the empire is not merely overstretched abroad. It is being rewired at home to reproduce overstretch more efficiently next time. And that is why this script cannot end on a fake both sides should de-escalate summary. That would be cleaner, safer, and flatter than the evidence deserves. The truth is harsher. This war has already exposed a structural problem in American power. The ability to begin with overwhelming force remains intact, but the ability to translate that force into a proportionate, stable, politically closed result is degrading. So let's answer the central question cleanly. What is Washington actually winning if 13,000 strikes still cannot buy an exit? It is winning destruction. It is winning the opening act. It is winning the visible part of war. But the invisible part, the part about closure, endurance, maritime order, budget discipline, institutional restraint, and strategic proportion, is where the story turns dark. If the United States pulls back now, then after all this firepower, the surviving lesson is simple. Iran endured, kept enough leverage alive, and proved that surviving the storm can be enough to deny a superpower. The kind of ending it came to impose. If the United States escalates further, then the lesson is different but no less brutal. A campaign already defined by staggering numbers now demands even more commitment, more money, more force protection, and more structural exception, all in pursuit of an outcome that each previous round of escalation has failed to secure. Either way, the title survives every objection. If Washington stops, there was still no clean exit after 13,000 strikes. If Washington stays, imperial overstretch is no longer a theory, it is the operating condition. So no, the strike count is not the answer to this story. It is the evidence against the answer Washington wanted to sell. The number tells you how much power was used. The failure of that number to produce closure tells you what kind of power problem this has become. And that is the point that should stay in the viewer's gut long after the footage ends. An empire does not enter overstretch when it becomes unable to hit. It enters overstretch when hitting stops being enough. Stay with this channel. We track the moment power mistakes, motion for control, before the rest of the system even admits the trap is there.